your desires are very important. Indeed, in an early Buddhist way of looking at things, desires make the world in various ways. We'll discuss those ways, some of them anyway, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find information about early Buddhism courses. Take a look at it. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And click the link down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. That is the bell. So what I want to discuss in today's video is the ways that desire makes the world for us. Because there are several. And I'll discuss them in three different ways. First of all, we'll look at a traditional understanding from early Buddhism of how desire makes the world for us in various ways. Then we'll turn to a more, let's say, pragmatic or down-to-earth kind of understanding, a more sort of everyday understanding of the ways that desire makes the world for us. And finally, I think we'll get to a deeper, I think a more underlying and fundamental way that desire makes the world for us. So to begin with, on a traditional Buddhist understanding, Buddhist cosmology traditionally revolves around desire, revolves around the actions, the effects that desire has upon us and on the world. Some people might say and have argued that traditional Buddhist cosmology really revolves entirely around desire, that desire is the sole engine of all cosmology. And this might be so, but I think it's debatable, let's put it that way. What I'm going to argue for here, or at least discuss, is the ways that desire is part of the key of Buddhist cosmology anyhow. Now, what we'll know is that one of the central aspects, arguably the central aspect to Buddhist cosmology, because that cosmology is centered around humans and people and sentient beings, the important part has to do with rebirth. That is to say that we've lived for an uncountable number of lifetimes before this one, and we will potentially live for an uncountable number of lifetimes after, unless or until we become enlightened, in which case we escape these rounds of rebirth. So that's the sort of the backbone here. And we may know that this rebirth is said to happen or be caused by and produced by our karma, or the karma that we accumulate within a lifetime or within a number of lifetimes. So that if we accumulate good karma, that will lead to us having a better future life, that we'll be reborn into a life that is more pleasant, better for us in some respects. And alternately, if we gather for ourselves a bunch of bad karma by doing the sorts of things that get that, I'll get to that in a moment, then we will have a lifetime in the future which is full of pain and suffering, or more than we would have had in this one, let's say, in this lifetime. So that's the general structure. Now, how does karma work? Now, for the Buddha, for early Buddhism, karma works in a particular fashion, at least in the most general scale, the most broad scale. The Buddha says that by karma he means intention. That is to say that it's the intention behind an action that gives it its karmic consequence, not really the action itself. And this is a key distinction. So, for example, we might do something that's very harmful to lots of people, perhaps results in suffering, great suffering. If we happen to do that with a pure mind, in other words, unintentionally, and with no reason to have foreseen this event, we have to imagine a case in which it's completely unintentional what we do. And again, that there was no way we could foresee it, that it's not an issue of us being foolish or something. If we do something unintentional, even if it has great harm, we are not karmically responsible for it. Indeed, if our intention was positive, if it was an intention rooted in, let's say, kindness or compassion, wisdom, then the karmic consequence could be good. In other words, we could be gaining for ourselves good karma even if the reaction, the external world, let's say, didn't follow along with us. Because as we will know, I think from our own lives, the external world doesn't always follow. We may be doing something very wise and correct and kind, but it may be that just for some vicissitude of life, that kindness falls on deaf ears for whatever reason. Similarly, however, we might do something of great benefit for the world, but do it from a root of greed or hatred, and that may do great benefit. However, if that root, if that intention is rooted in greed or hatred or ignorance in some fundamental sense, we will get bad karma, at least for the Buddha, on that end. That is to say, again, the karma depends upon the intention, not the action itself. Now, having said that, it's important to stress that there are all kinds of nuances that the Buddha discussed and that were discussed in later texts around karma. And the Buddha himself said that if you want to understand karma completely, you're going to drive yourself crazy, that the only people who can understand it, according to him, were awakened or enlightened beings who could sort of see it for themselves. So we have to be careful not to simplify it too much. There are aspects, or said to be aspects, of results as well, perhaps, on karmic consequence. But that shouldn't delay us in the general point we're making, which is generally, it's our desires that make for us our next lifetimes. Where desire here is understood in the broad sense to encompass both greed, which is desire for something, and anger or hatred, which is a strong desire against something, that is to say, to destroy something or to harm somebody. That's hatred. So these both should be encompassed by this form of desire, which is the problem here, at least when it comes to negative karma. That is to say, if we have one of these particularly strong sorts of negative desires behind our action, it's going to create for us a bad next lifetime. On the other hand, if we have beneficial desires, and the Buddha did, we should make a point here, describe beneficial desires as well, the desires for kindness for others, that others have good lives. If we do if we do loving kindness meditation, we are trying to foster in ourselves desires for the well-being of others. Compassion involves a desire that people who are suffering get over the suffering and become well again. These are beneficial desires, and these desires as well can create for us a next lifetime. In fact, they create, according to the Buddha, a next lifetime that is beneficial for us, that it is more positive. I did actually a prior video on desires. I'll put a link to it down below if you want to read how desires work in that sense, that there are these two different kinds for the Buddha. And there's also the desires that are realized in good meditative states. So we may have a desire to realize states of what's called jhana, or deep states of absorptive meditation that are extremely pleasant. And the Buddha says that if we become proficient in these states, we can be reborn into future lives that are entirely within the domain of those states. That is to say, we reborn in planes that we only experience these pleasant states of meditation, which is supposed to be of great benefit, a greatly positive and pleasant kind of state of affairs. So these are all ways in which, in a traditional understanding, our desires manufacture the world for us in a certain way. They bring us to where we are going to be reborn. In another sutta, the Buddha discusses what he calls the dog duty and the ox duty ascetics, who were certain kinds of ascetics back in ancient India. People who would go around living their lives as a dog or as an ox or as some kind of creature like this. And they believed that by doing this, they were gaining for themselves positive karma that would lead to a better lifetime or potentially some form of enlightenment, awakening. But when one of these or two of these people go to discuss this with the Buddha tells them that this is not good. That if you spend your life as a dog with the desires of a dog, or as an ox with the desires of an ox, you will be reborn as a dog or as an ox in the next lifetime. So this is a particular way that the Buddha claims that our next life is directly influenced by the kinds of desires and actions that we undertake. And within early Buddhism, there's this kind of, I would say, this sort of uneasy or ill-described, not completely described sort of reciprocity between the mind and the world, the internal and the external, our desires and physical things, that sort of run together. Again, not well described, but the general idea is that our karmic actions motivate what we're going to feel and experience in our next lifetime. And in order for that to be truly realized, there must be some reciprocity between the world and us, so that somebody with bad karma, let's say, is born into a situation, is surrounded by a situation in which the world is going to respond to them in negative ways, and the reverse, and if the case is good karma. Now, we also have to keep in mind, I always like to talk about the nuances here because we don't want to get a wrong idea, although I can't go into every nuance, there's too many of them, but at least some of them, the most important nuances, let's say. There's a nuance here, which is that not everything that we experience is due to karma. The Buddha says this at one point in the Suttas. He rejects the idea, which I believe is a Jain idea, that everything we experience is from our own karma. What the Buddha says is that, yes, a lot of what we experience is due to karma. Let's say it may be that an illness or some misfortune that befalls us does so because of our karma. But it may simply be that an illness befalls us because of some problem with the makeup of our body, some circumstance in our intestines, or some bug that we happen to get. Again, the Buddha's understanding of illness was not along a current medical model, but we can understand it medically that, sometimes it's due to karma and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just the roll of the dice. So to that extent, we have to be a little careful in our understanding of how karma works, even on a traditional perspective. But there's another, we might say, more pragmatic or down-to-earth way that desires make the world. Our desires make the world. If we look around us, if you look around you now, indeed you're looking at a computer screen of some kind right now, everything that you see, including that computer screen, including YouTube, including these videos, everything that you see, or virtually everything you see, I would say, is made by certain kinds of human desires. Certainly our computers, our houses, our homes, our clothing, what we hang on our walls, what music we listen to, what we eat, all of it is produced at some level by human desires. The people who produced these things had desires to make a certain kind of thing, to bring it forward in the world in order to make people happy. They also produced them in order to make a salary or make some kind of payment for themselves. They had a desire to make a living for themselves and support themselves, be able to afford food and lodging themselves. And when you bought these things, or picked them up off the street if they happened to be thrown out, you were doing that because of your own desires, because you wanted a certain kind of thing. You wanted a computer, you wanted a cell phone, you wanted something to hang on your wall, whatever it might be. And these are all, of course, a litany of human desires, and we surround, and in this way we surround ourselves, if you like, with the residue of human desires of one kind or another. And I want to stress that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We shouldn't think of this as necessarily a bad thing, even on an early Buddhist understanding. Because even monastics have to support themselves in the sense that they need clothing, they need a begging bowl, they need medicine and a roof over their heads, they need food. And so we have certain needs that have to be satisfied, and those needs are going to be satisfied by desires, which on a Buddhist understanding in this case are beneficial desires. And the Buddha also lauded lay people who used their wealth, what he would term their honestly gained wealth, their legitimately gained wealth. We assume that the layperson is established in an honest business. The Buddha had nothing against a layperson using that wealth to make themselves and others happy. Indeed, the Buddha said that a layperson should use their wealth to make themselves and other people happy. And part of the way that a layperson is going to do that, even on the Buddha's understanding, is to satisfy certain kinds of ordinary desires. To buy things for people, to buy things for themselves, to make themselves look nice. And these are all topics I discussed in one of my courses over at the Online Dharma Institute. Again, if you want to see those courses, there's a link down below in the notes. So we have to think of these as being potential positives as well. Even nature itself is largely constructed by human desires, at least at some level. Artificial selection has worked on plants now for millennia, which is why we have things like the corn that we have nowadays, which looks nothing like the original plant. We see this in plants, we see it in animals. Dogs in particular have been artificially selected for millennia. That's why they look very different from wolves. Many of us will know this. As well, we surround ourselves with gardens, with trees that have been selected and pruned and dealt with in various ways to make us happy, to look nice. I used to think of Central Park in New York as being sort of a pristine landscape. When I was a child, I sort of thought of it, must have been looking like this for thousands of years and been preserved here. But as a matter of fact, Central Park in New York is completely artificial. Everything there basically was brought in from somewhere else or moved or changed. The stones, the trees, the water features, all of it is, or essentially all of it is artificial. These are all ways that humans manufacture an environment to look nice. And so much of what we think of in the world either has been manufactured to look nice or at least has been affected by human occupation and human intervention for thousands and thousands of years. There's very little left on Earth that hasn't been affected this way, even of the broader environment. And of course, now we also see the downsides to this. We see the downsides in terms of large-scale environmental degradation, and of course with global warming as well, which is a truly global phenomenon that's brought about, we might say, partly or largely or even entirely by human desires. Human desires that at least they all have side impacts on everything. And when they're all summed together, we have truly global impacts, some of which are quite concerning. And indeed, I've done earlier videos about this topic. I'll put a link to them down below, some of them down below. The third way that desire makes the world for us is, I think, in a much more fundamental and deep way, and I think more difficult to see and understand. This is the way in which our desires, and through them our attachments and identifications with the world, infuse it with a kind of magic or a kind of essence that isn't there otherwise. So we might consider, for example, what somebody from another planet, let's say, or from some other place who is completely ignorant, might look at, let's say, our team sports. They might see a game of basketball, baseball, whatever it might be, soccer, and not understand anything of what's going on. It would be meaningless to them. It wouldn't mean anything. It wouldn't be interesting. It wouldn't be captivating. They wouldn't see what the point of it was. Even if we describe the rules to them, they might have the same kind of reaction. But once we have been infused with desires, largely coming in this case perhaps from where we live, that might impact which teams we like, perhaps the team logo or mascot, or perhaps somebody on the team that we identify with, all of a sudden that changes completely. And we go from a situation of not caring, of not having anything to do with this, to caring deeply, to the extent that, let's say if a foul is called on our team, we may want to discount that foul. We may think that it's irrelevant, that they should overlook it, that it was only a minor little thing, that really the refs shouldn't care about that. Whereas if the same thing happened to the opposing team, we would scream and yell about it, and we would be heartily angered or offended if the refs were willing to discount such a foul on the other side. This is a way that our vision of the world is completely changed by our desires. With our desires, suddenly it's this style of artwork, this style of music, this style of clothing that is worthwhile, that's worthy, that's beautiful, that's interesting. And this other style or this other music, this other kind of clothing, well, that's just bad taste. That's an example of your degeneracy, that you would like this. This is the way that our desires, our innate attachments, change the world for us. They change our perception of what's worthwhile and what's not. They also, when it comes to, let's say, the look of somebody, whether they're attractive or not, their skin color can make a difference as to whether we offer somebody a job. More attractive people tend to get better jobs. People who are taller, people who are, as we know, there's an issue with racism, where people of certain races or with certain kinds of names that perhaps indicate what race they might be less likely to get a job than somebody with a different name that's more common in their culture, that's more highly looked upon by the people who are in power. That is, people who are in power tend to have desires, more positive kinds of desires for people that look like them, that they identify with. Again, desire and identity are inextricably linked in this way, that when we like something and desire it, we identify with it. And these are ways that desires then propagate in society generally and manufacture a kind of society. And all of these judgments that we make about the world, about what we like and what we don't like, what we desire and what we don't identify with, these are all buttressed by stories that we tell ourselves about why one thing is better than another. Stories that we will happily discuss with the broader world. And indeed, that's what largely we see in our media nowadays, is stories that people tell about why their desires are better than the desires of other people. This is the kind of thing that indeed supports this way that the desires impact the world. These stories support that by attempting to buttress them with narratives of various kinds. In his recent book on why Buddhism is true, Robert Wright, the journalist and writer Robert Wright, discusses a couple of examples in the ways that these desires that we have infuse the world with a kind of essence, an essence of good or bad. He discusses how a few years ago, apparently, somebody purchased a tape measure that was apparently owned by John F. Kennedy and was willing to pay something around $49,000 for this object. Presumably, he was willing to pay this kind of money because he felt that it was infused with a kind of an essence of John F. Kennedy that a normal tape measure would not have been. And so Robert Wright asks us to consider the case that perhaps after a time, the auction house from which he bought this tape measure might call the person back and say, "I'm sorry, sir, we've made a terrible mistake. We thought that we had sent you John F. Kennedy's tape measure, but there was a mix-up during the auction, and in fact, we ended up putting on display a tape measure that was owned by our plumber, and so we've sent you the wrong tape measure." And we can imagine what might occur in the mind of the person who had spent $49,000 on this object looks at it, the same object that he's been looking at perhaps for months now, and all of a sudden it becomes worthless. It's not a different object, it's exactly the same one, it hasn't changed at all, except that it's lost this kind of desirable essence. It no longer has the aura of having been owned by a famous person. Robert Wright also discusses an example with Nazi war criminal Hermann Goering, who believed that he had acquired a Vermeer. Now Vermeer, Johannes Vermeer, is one of the most famous painters in the Dutch golden age of painting. And nowadays, some of the most valuable paintings are by Vermeer. And so Goering believed that he had acquired one of these paintings, but apparently at some point, I believe after the war, he was told that this painting he had acquired was actually a forgery and was not by Vermeer at all. And when he was told this, Wright says, one of the observers to this conversation noted that it looked as if for the first time Hermann Goering had discovered that there was evil in the world. So in this case, in the case of Hermann Goering, we might even say that the essence of a painting, the essence of a physical object like this, was apparently to him more important, more valuable, more desirable than the essence of so many people that had ended up dying or being murdered by the Nazi regime. There's a certain amount of deep irony in this kind of case, this kind of story. So we can see various ways that desire, in fact, manufactures a world for us by providing it with the appearance of essences of reality that aren't there otherwise, that aren't there in a case that we have no particular desire for this object. If we don't care about John F. Kennedy or Vermeer, then these objects revert to their normal state. We don't think that they're worth $49,000 in the case of the tape measure. Now, on a traditional understanding, we might say that part of the effect of karma is precisely to infuse the world with certain kinds of mistaken views of the world that make it either overly rosy or perhaps overly painful, that we will infuse the world with certain kinds of misperceptions of the way things are according to our karmic baggage. This is one of the stories that's told in traditional Buddhism, that is one of the ways that karma gets its way across, is by modifying our minds in certain ways to make us prone to these kinds of misinterpretations of the world. And indeed, as Robert Wright says in his book on why Buddhism is true, and indeed I have a video about that, I'll put a link to the video down below, a video reviewing the book, it's our practice of non-self that helps us get out from under these kinds of mistaken viewpoints, this kind of alteration of our view of the world, our tendency to, as the Buddha says, view the unlovely as lovely, or view the unbeautiful as beautiful. We can take an example like the example of the tape measure as an example of seeing the unlovely as lovely in this case. Adding $49,000 to its value is kind of doing just that. These kinds of mistaken viewpoints that arise, these are some of the targets that we aim our practice of non-self at, beginning to understand that these essences are only appearances. They're mistaken appearances of the world, viewing the impermanent as permanent. This is one of the classic ways that desire works upon us. So, for example, desire says that we two will be together for all eternity, when we know that in reality that's not possible, that all things will eventually come to an end, including any relationships that we have. That's sad, it's part of the dukkha of change. But desire makes us forget this. It makes us look at the world with different glasses. And what we need to do is to find what we might call a more objective way of looking at the world, a way that views the world more realistically, more accurately. And I indeed did a past video on just that topic, on finding a practice that allows us to see the world more objectively, and I would suggest taking a look at it. I'll put a link to it up on the screen here. You can click on it now. If you're interested in these videos, if you find them useful, please do check out my Patreon page. It's linked down below. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you be well.